Boa tarde. Está a acabar de entrar. Ok. Muito boa tarde e bem-vindos à última sessão desta segunda edição das Álvaro Siza Talks, que tem decorrido desde a semana passada na quarta, quinta e sexta-feira, e hoje fechamos com o Jacques Herzog o programa. É uma grande honra e um privilégio ter o Jacques Herzog aqui conosco. Também é um duplo privilégio ter o Eduardo Souto Moura a apresentar o Jacques Herzog. E vou passar só um momento para o inglês, antes de só para apresentar, mas vai ser o Eduardo que vai fazer a apresentação. So welcome everyone once again. Welcome Jack. It's a real honor and a real privilege to have you here. And I have to say that when we first started thinking of this edition of the Siza Talks, which aim at fostering debate and discussion around contemporary architecture, around themes and values present in Siza's work, when we discussed that this second edition would be around the notion of matter and materiality, of course, one of the first, if not the first, practice that came to mind was Herzog and Meuron. And that's for many reasons. So this continuous investigation on materiality, I would even say into physicality, and this continuous conversation or even dialogue between surface and volume, which I think has been a continuous investigation of your work, which is very, very, very important. So I'm not going to give the introduction today, so that's going to be Eduardo Souto Moura. I also would like to thank Eduardo, e volto para o português muito brevemente, para agradecer o Eduardo a amabilidade e a disponibilidade para fazer esta apresentação, e só dizer que o Eduardo vai falar em francês, porque, bom, uma cortesia para o Jacques Herzog, que é a língua na que eles se conheceram e na que eles sempre falam, uma língua que ele conhece bem e, portanto, bem-vindo, obrigado, Eduardo, faz favor.
Bom, boa noite, é um gosto estar aqui. Vou falar em português para vocês e pedir desculpa porque há muita gente nova que não entende francês, penso eu. Mas também não é importante o que eu vou dizer. Eu tenho algumas dificuldades em falar inglês e não gosto. E depois do Brexit, então detesto mesmo falar inglês. Vou falar francês porque identifico-me, toda a vida falei francês com o Jacques e antes de mais queria agradecer au fait de estar aqui. Bien, je parle en français, c'est un peu un hommage et c'est cordial que vous devez comprendre ce que je veux dire. L'anglais, je ne veux pas, j'ai expliqué, tu as compris. Et on s'est connus à 31 ans, en 1988, à Harvard. Et on a fait une exposition ensemble à Harvard qui s'appelait Emerging European Architects. En 1989, on a été invité pour Raphaël Moneo à devenir professeur dans cette école d'architecture. Et comme ça, on est allé là de 15 en 15 jours. On faisait les classes au matin et après-midi, on dînait ensemble, ou à Boston, ou à Cambridge. Et on parlait d'architecture surtout parce qu'on ne se connaissait pas. Et surtout, on parlait d'architecture, quelle a été l'influence des maîtres qui nous ont formés. Moi, je parlais de l'importance de Siza pour moi, et il parlait de l'importance d'Aldo Rossi, qui était son professeur à Zurich. Et on discutait comme au football. Non, Rossi, Siza, comme ça. Et c'était intéressant. Et on parlait aussi, surtout, du futur. Qu'est-ce qu'on va faire? Nous sommes jeunes, on a fait des conférences pour présenter notre projet. Je pense qu'il a montré une maison seulement. C'était la Maison Bleue pour un photographe. Non, la Maison Bleue, c'était une chose. La maison pour le photographe était une autre. Et moi, j'ai présenté le marché à Praga. Bien. Pendant ces discussions, il m'a dit, un soir, en prenant un peu de cognac et moi un whisky, dit, Eduardo, je vais être l'architecte plus fameux en 30 ans. Et j'étais étonné, il est fou. Comment il dit ça? Et le problème est qu'il est devenu l'architecte plus important passé les 30 ans. Pendant les années 90, à mon avis, il est devenu l'architecte plus important. Et pourquoi? Parce qu'il a réussi à faire des croisements entre l'art contemporain. Il m'a parlé beaucoup de Beuys, il a travaillé avec Beuys. Après, il m'a parlé, qui habitait à Zurich, de Donald Judd. Il a fait un croisement étrange entre l'art contemporain, l'architecture vernaculaire, l'art conceptuel, et il a compris les origines de l'art contemporain avec les influences vernaculaires et naïves de l'art africain, l'art grec. Maintenant, un ami m'a offert un livre très intéressant, je n'ai pas lu, je n'ai pas de temps, mais j'ai vu les photos, il avait beaucoup d'images de Picasso qui a copié les images de l'art grec. Jamais j'ai pensé que l'art grec a influencé Picasso. Aussi Giacometti, les figures africaines, et on a parlé de tout ça. Heureusement, sans des convictions fortes, des doutes. Et c'est ça qui fait donner la recherche. Bien, en des années, il est venu ici Peter Cook, un architecte anglais qui appartenait à l'Archigramme. Il a fait un commentaire en disant « Je suis étonné pourquoi la nouvelle architecture à Porto est influencée par des Suisses. Je vois Herzog partout. » Et j'ai pensé pourquoi. Et c'est facile. J'ai connu Jacques, on a fait ses classes, j'ai étudié Jacques, j'aime beaucoup son architecture. C'est la vérité, de temps en temps, je l'ai copié, pour des raisons, parce que j'aime, pourquoi pas dire. Et je l'ai invité à venir à Porto. Il est venu avec Peter Zumthor, et Zumthor avait seulement la chapelle. Et pour dire la vérité, il n'est pas ici. Les choses ne sont pas passées très bien, à mon avis, parce qu'il y avait une certaine tension entre toi et Zumthor. Je ne sais pas si c'est vrai ou non. À partir de ça, les étudiants à l'école, ils ont venu des fins. Herzog était comme une pop star. Et tout le temps que j'invitais Jacques au Pierre, parce que c'est son partenaire, il a dit oui. Il est venu une fois avec Zumthor. Après, il est venu plus de 3 fois, une à Lisbonne, parce qu'il y a toujours la guerre à Porto-Lisbonne. Ils étaient furieux, les architectes de Lisbonne. Mais pourquoi Jacques, il va toujours à Porto, il ne vient pas à Lisbonne? OK, il faut inviter Jacques pour aller à Lisbonne. Et il est venu à Lisbonne. Et maintenant, c'est la 5e fois qu'il est ici à Porto. Et je me demande pourquoi il est aussi gentil de venir. Parce qu'il a une vie très difficile. Il m'a offert un livre qui s'appelle 001, 500. Et je pense en 500 projets. Et à la fin, il y a une photo très belle avec, je pense, son bureau. Et j'ai eu la patience avec le doigt, de trouver tous les collaborateurs. Il était 231 mondial. Et alors, il vient à Porto. Il est fou. Il a du temps pour venir. Et pourquoi il vient? Parce que je pense qu'il a une empathie, une amitié avec notre pays, notre ville, notre école et des jeunes architectes. Ils ont travaillé avec lui et peut-être c'est pour ça la raison, parce que Peter Cook, il demande pourquoi l'architecture suisse, il est influencé à Porto pour les jeunes. Et à mon avis, il y a un croisement entre Siza et Herzog dans les nouvelles générations. Et je pense que tous les jeunes que j'ai envoyés chez lui, il a dit oui. Et d'autres fois, c'est lui qui m'a demandé pour des jeunes qui sont partis pour venir de nouveau. Je parle de Serralves, c'est un grand architecte portugais jeune, à travailler chez lui. Camilo Rebelo. Camilo, il n'est pas ici. Il m'a téléphoné hier soir en disant pour te saluer. Après, Nuno Brandão, Pedro Ramalho, Pedro Polónio et d'autres. Je ne vais pas faire la liste des téléphones jaunes. Et je me demande pourquoi il y a ces reconnaissances pour la nouvelle architecture portugaise des jaunes. Et je pense surtout, il y a des amis, il aime venir ici, on mange bien, on se voit, mais surtout, une fois, il m'a dit, de tous les architectes, pas de ma génération, des anciens maîtres, ça semble le livre de Thomas Bernard, des anciens maîtres, de tout ce que j'ai plus de respect, c'est pour Álvaro Siza, et c'est pour ça qu'il est ici. Merci.
Thank you so much, Eduardo. It is difficult to say something after these words of introduction. One thing for sure, I'm really sorry that I cannot speak Portuguese. And I recently learned some Spanish, but I think that this would not be easier. So sorry to continue this presentation in English. What you said at the end, Eduardo, is the full truth. I have huge admiration for Álvaro Siza and also for you. I just saw your exhibition today in Matosinhos, and it's a very impressive exhibition. I recommend everybody to see the collection of projects, and it really goes back to these early days that you mentioned when you and we hadn't done so much work, but I think, to say without arrogance, that the beginning of the work, both of you, but also of our own practice, shows something that was different at that time than the beginning postmodernism with which we could not deal very much. So between Aldo Rossi and Siza, my work tended much more towards Siza, even if it's so personal that for me it was difficult to really start with such an attitude. We had really huge problems at the very beginning to start, because nobody knows what is really architecture. As a young architect, you really have to start from scratch. And especially we wanted to start from scratch, from nothing, from zero, because we distrusted what we saw. So the corporeal, the body of architecture was an obvious theme, an obvious start. We wanted to push architecture towards something which was based on physical, material essence, something that we believe has been forgotten in modernity. By the way, this presentation will be not very long. It will be divided in 3 parts. One is this corporeal, this physical, this material issue. Then it will be followed by an issue where I speak about structure, equal space, equal ornament, so this totality of architecture. And at the end, I will speak about landscape. So this material, physical essence, this is one of our first buildings. It was conceived in 1984 and finished in 1988. What did we do? We did a building built in wood, all in wood. And what we were interested is not so much the neo-historical aspect it has, but as the sketches show, we were interested in shaping wood so that it would become different when you touch it. when this was turned with a special machine, very old-fashioned technology, and if you touch it, it has almost an erotic feeling. It's really like a member of your body. Whereas the background, these doors, have a more traditional making. Even if it's the same material, it has a totally different expression, but also a different feel. Always, at the end, this is conceptual, this is pure thinking, but if you don't know that, it doesn't matter. You understand it as soon as you touch it, as soon as you are near it. That is perhaps the goal of this research of physicality, that it speaks to everybody immediately, without any academic backpack. Another example of this early research is the signal box wrapped with copper. The intention was, that was like an excuse of course, that it was filled with computers that were highly delicate. And we wanted to protect it with copper bands wrapping around, which would build a kind of a Faraday cage. We discovered, while using the copper, that we could twist the copper bands because the material is very soft, and that it would create a porosity, a permeability, nevertheless being a monolithic object that weathers beautifully. And we were close to the workers to see and to understand how they would apply the material to the structure. We then, as Eduardo puts it, we had a strong proximity to artists with whom we tend to collaborate. One important artist was, or is, Thomas Ruff, the photographer from Düsseldorf. We wanted to find out if it's possible to do the most stupid, simple form, and with a kind of a tattoo. That was a time when the people were not so much tattooed as they are today, but the building, all over it tattooed, would make for something different, would be like a mental space in which you could enter and which would be juxtaposed with a physical space. We developed a method that doesn't exist, a method with which we could use concrete like paper. So the concrete, the surface of the concrete was treated with a chemical cream onto which then the photography was projected and was engraved literally into the surface. So in fact, it is a kind of a tattoo. It's not painted or printed on it, but it's literally in the skin of the surface, as you can see. And then we also followed the production and the fabrication very closely and produced these concrete slabs based on motifs by Thomas Ruff of recent German history. This picture, you can see the juxtaposition of real space here, where you could penetrate, and of image space. The images were tattooed on the concrete slabs that is in the lower part, and as well on the skylight, on the glass bands that are wrapping around the building. I think the most interesting project for this material research is the Dominus Winery, which I consider one of the most interesting works we have done so far. It is a pile of stones, simply spoken, as you could say, filled in gabions, which is a product that exists or existed on the market and that was used to fight erosion on riverbeds. Dominus is one of the greatest wines in the world, I must say, for California, and the wine is being made by Christian Moueix, who is a very famous Bordeaux winemaker. He's best known for producing Chateau Petrus. So an amazingly interesting man, very interested in art and architecture. And here, on this piece of land in Napa, he could buy this piece of land, which was producing already in the early 20th century a wine named Inglenook, one of the great American wines. And when they started to produce wine on this field, they discovered a lot of Indian finds, which were more than 1,000 or 2,000 years old, which means that this land is a very fertile piece of land. It's an extraordinary piece of landscape. We had a lot of respect, but also we admired the beauty of this landscape. And the building that we had in mind would be something which is very powerful and very modest at the same time. And in that we used the volcanic stone of the region. The building sometimes disappears, like a stealth building. And as you come closer, you can discern, you can discover that we have smaller stones in the lower part and taller stones in the upper part. The building begins to unveil its qualities, its sculptural qualities, but also its specialty, because it is very massive, very solid, very brutal, but at the same time it's very light. As you walk through, you see the counter light from the backside, and you see that when in those parts where we collected the big stones, there is gaps, distance between the stones that let the light shine through, like lace, like underwear. So it's almost like a cinematic walk through the building. As you walk through the building, it unveils like different layers of materiality, of solidity, but also of lightness. It's a very simple alignment of the different parts of the production. At the far right, this is the cellar of the first year and the cellar in the barracks in the second year. Then we have the big arch in between. This is the cuvée, the cuve. This is the steel tank area, another working area, an arch, and this is the finished wine in the crate. So it's a linear production, as in all wineries, basically. It is also built very simply, stupidly, with steel and prefabricated concrete, and the stone is a layer outside. It's just attached like a second wall. And the idea was, of course, architectural, was of course about beauty, but it was also about ecology, about inertia. The stones are very heavy, and the strong heat during the day would be kept by the stones, and at night the energy would be released. The client decided nevertheless to build air conditioning for $1.5 million, and we said you could give the money to us, you wouldn't need it. But they built it, but they have never put it in action. So we started to build the stones. It's a very large building, and you can see in different parts that at the beginning the workers didn't know exactly how to pile up the stones. We also understood that we had to add a fine mesh on top of this layer, because otherwise the rattlesnakes would invade the stones, and as you come close to the building, they would jump at your face. So building can be very dangerous, and if you do experimental stuff in architecture, as we've done many times, there is quite a danger of liability, especially in America. We also work on the site. You can see Pierre here explaining this issue about the smaller stones and the larger stones and the effect it has on the light that shines through the building. This works very well during the day as the sun hits the building, and the form of the stone is one thing and the form of the gap is the other thing. And this other form is projected on the glass wall inside and produces quite a wonderful, playful game that animates the interior spaces. We currently work on a new winery now for the same client in Saint-Emilion. So I guess, Eduardo, I will come a sixth time in a few years and present that one also. We also, of course, love, I show this image, even if it's not related to the stone, because I like the panoramic quality. In Switzerland, you don't have such open landscapes. So when we travel as architects, and we come from a very small country, just as you guys in Portugal, it's always amazing as you discover landscapes that you are not familiar with, that open up totally new ways. And this panoramic view, which almost has a cinematographic quality, is certainly also an interesting part of that particular project. And not only the stone and the gap are part of the materiality that I would like to mention, but of course also the gabion. The gabion is metallic, and the metallic has a slightly reflecting quality, and as soon as the sun goes down in the evening, it comes from the side, and the metal becomes more important and more obvious almost as the stone, and it adds a small layer, like a little bit of fog on top of the stone wall. And at night, the light shines out from inside and reveals the same build-up of the wall. The second part, as I said, is perhaps the one thing that we work most on, and most of the projects are now dominated by this obsession of the structure being a main actor to create space and ornament. It is remindful of historic architecture where structure and space and ornament were one and the same thing. There's no difference. Everything that you see is structural, is space-making, and is ornamental. When I say ornamental, I mean the facade. I don't mean decorative. I mean the result of everything integrated. Everything integrated in one thing. Certainly, I just show a few examples. One of our most beautiful buildings still today is Prada in Tokyo, which is, I think, a good example for this approach. It has an existence of a light-filled glazed body from outside, but in fact is built up in a very physical way. And every slab, every core that runs through the building stiffens the structure and creates the space, and creates the ornamental aspect from outside. You can see that it's built almost like a ship. Every steel member holds this whole thing together. Nothing is added. Everything is part of that space-making ornamental structure. Even those tubes, which now, as you visit it from inside, seem so feminine and so innocent. Everything was invented for this, every material, every silicon skin, every member that was clad, but is in fact structure with a skin on top. Then an obvious example is the bird's nest in Beijing, which has a very ornamental exterior, but in fact is a very important space that never we were interested in an Olympic stadium for an Olympic game. We were just interested in creating a space that would be done for the people. And in fact, this image shows the bird's nest in a post-Olympic, after Olympic condition, which is now a highly popular space to hang out, to hang around, and to come together. It is not just a surface, but it's a space where you can climb up, where you can walk in, almost comparable to what the Eiffel Tower did originally, and especially now that it has become a popular icon for Paris. You can see that weddings are being celebrated. It's used for everything but for sports. And we couldn't believe, and we were collaborated for this project with the Chinese artist Ai Weiwei. We couldn't believe that they would accept the design, because the design is, you can see that with these members, with these structural pieces, this is real heavy stuff. It was built in a shipyard near Shanghai, so 2,000 kilometers away, and was brought to Beijing on the road. It has amazing pictures. I could show you many more, between an almost archaic bamboo structured workplaces on site and the very avant-garde steel technology to put these members together. And even when we saw that in those days, we wouldn't believe they would build it according to the plans, especially with those round shapes, distorted forms that were complicated to make, but were essential to produce the beauty of the structure as we envisioned it. As you can see here, where this layer between outside and the sport field inside, this whole space is structural and is the space that you visit, and is also the ornamental exterior. Another example that you may know and you have seen before is Lincoln Road, which I show in a bit more images. We like this project. We like this project because this is Lincoln Road in Miami. And we like this project because it has an interesting history. At the right hand, you see the bank building that our client has been buying, and at the left-hand side, you see the diagram of the building that was possible to build. And the client was a very courageous man, and he hired us, and he said, you can certainly do something with this building. And we said, we should try to connect these two buildings because they belong together, so the new building should be the same height as the old building, but not with not more gross area. So you shouldn't have more profit, you should just spend more money. And we went to the authorities, and the client and I were fighting to get an extra permission to reach the same height, but not more floors. So we can, in total, he would have the same amount of occupancy, the same amount of profit, but in a much more wider and much more space consuming way. And we came up with this very surprising design where structure and space and ornament is identical. It couldn't be more clear. But in contrast to the previous schemes that I showed, here the structure takes on an even more playful role, because the columns are not normal columns, but they are twisted and turned, and they have almost a dancing quality. And this sketch shows how this works, and especially how it works based on this diagram of movement of cars. We wanted to create those pillars which were not organized in a rectangular system, because we wanted to give it a more dancing character in this tropic climate, in this lush vegetation. And we wanted to do a garage, because that was actually the program, a garage which would be much more than a garage, which would be at the same time a shopping area, a bar, a restaurant, and a residence. And because people are so much based on their outside, they do these fitness things, they they pump up their breasts, they do all this very much based on exterior of appearing and beautiful exteriors. We said people like cars and they like to drive cars up through this building. So the building literally lets the car drive up, and the pillars make space for those cars. And this diagram shows some thinking how we organize these different slabs to make space for the cars, but at the same time, and I think that was the interesting thing about this project, every column has a bit of a different condition, so every column is not just a piece of structure and space, but has an individual space-making quality. If you walk in nature, then every tree in a forest or in a park has a bit of a different form and has a different space that invites you more or less to sit or to rest or to do this or that. So the columns take an active role in offering space. You can see that also here on this photograph. We have many different activities: dinners, fashion shows, yoga classes, and also, of course, car parking. And you can see as people walk through there how people occupy the space in very different ways, that the columns have a totally different role than in the generic organization. And of course also the extra height and the different floor levels, heights of floor levels make for the quality of these different spaces. It has been used, of course, as a backdrop for films and for many activities that, as I said, in Miami is very hip, is very fashionable. And the client liked the building and wanted to stay there, and so we built a residence on top of the garage with a garden that connects different floors, like hanging gardens, and which make you believe that you are living somewhere in the landscape. And of course it offers very nice views across Miami Beach, as you can see here. This is a bar, shopping, and all these different floors that were for parking and for, as you could see, the yoga classes, the residence in the top floors here. The latest in this group of structure I want to show is Hong Kong, the M+, which is will be opening in a good year from now, in a difficult political situation. And we're very happy to do this project because we think that the project responds well to what Hong Kong needs or what Hong Kong can do. Hong Kong was not a place for art before Art Basel went there. It is purely commercial, based on trade, a purely commercial place. Heavy infrastructure. And the infrastructure, you can see the red thread that connects the airport here on the Kowloon site with the city, is an underground, is a tunnel, and the tunnel runs right through the land parcel where the competition was held for the museum. And of course you had to span across this tunnel. But unlike the others, we said this tunnel is interesting because it's the only historical, is almost an archaeological element. It's a very powerful infrastructural element. And so we said, whatever we do, we want to dig out the ground. We want to go down to the very lowest part and want to dig out what is there. So the tunnel and the step here in the ground is part of the building. And from there, the structure goes up, and every floor and every pillar is based and rooted on this ground. Because otherwise, it's just a landfill, and it's just an anonymous piece of land across from Hong Kong. Based on this idea, you can see here the the underground tunnel, and right across, of course, with a fat level layer of concrete, we create an underground space which could be called a found space or industrial space or tank room, which is very rough, production-oriented spaces where artists, contemporary artists, can display and can produce artworks. So art is displayed like on different layers. It has this very archaic underground layer. Then it has this floor, which is the entrance level, where you have the Kunsthalle, the temporary exhibition hall, and then you have the main podium, which is here in the middle. The main podium, which is this hovering piece, and then we have the slab. The slab has art in lobbies, in visitor spaces, in member rooms. So art and visitors go all the way up through the building. These are some renderings which can show how life would be in the future in these underground spaces, which is a lot of media art, a lot of projection, a lot of new type of artworks. This is here above would be the entrance level. And this is the in-between level above these tank rooms. You can see that this has a kind of a diagonal dynamic which adds a very powerful energy in the building. We wanted this train tunnel not only to be there as an archaeological relic, but also as an energetic expression of the crazy infrastructural components that so much shape the city. These are very recent pictures from the site which demonstrate a bit more than the renderings, the incredible powerful structural expression of these spaces. The spaces are amazing in the dimension, but also in the diversity. As you walk through the building, you find so many totally different spatial conditions. It's a very heterotopic museum. You have views across the building down, but also upwards in a slit from where you see the slab going up through the building. And of course, it has these very powerful spans that are needed to span these kind of girders, which are needed to span across the subway tunnel. This is that underground space that is visible in one floor, but it goes deep down. Then it has this hovering slab, which is for the more traditional galleries, and then the slab that I mentioned before, that goes all the way up. The slab is very thin, so it's very transparent and the structure shines through. And this slab is not just offices and member rooms and viewing points, but it is also a big screen. It has horizontal lines in which we inscribe LED lights, so artists can use this screen to produce artworks, which are like, in a subversive way, integrated in the skyline of Hong Kong. This is the build-up that I mentioned. This is the found space with the tunnel. This is the platform in between, and this is the podium. The podium is this kind of horizontal piece, which is hovering above, like a roof. And from there, the slab shoots up vertically. It's like two pieces that define the space above the underground. It will be clad with some ceramic tiles, which are dark green, and when the sun hits them, it becomes almost yellowish golden. It has many different spaces, as I said. This is the education part, is like a house under the whole building, with stairs from both sides, which are outdoor auditoriums, and also access routes through the building to bring people up on the garden above. You can see here some of this ceramic tiles and the stair that brings people up. And some of the finished slab. You can see here that these are horizontal layers, through which you can see through, which are shading from the sunlight, but also make space for these LED inscriptions. The podium with the main galleries. This is the entrance floor from where you see down in this sunken part, but also through these light wells you see up directly to this slab. That's the view you will get once it's opening. This is the floor of the main podium. This is where visitors come up from where they go to the galleries. As you can see here or here. Galleries are all around, like built in quadrants, mixed all together, very different light conditions, skylight, sidelight. And as I said, it was important for us, the red is spaces for art, that art leads you all the way through the building. It's not, it doesn't, even if this is below ground, the below ground is as important and as fascinating as the very much above. We wanted to give diversity, but also give each part an equally interesting condition. Some aspects of the galleries, which are in the current status almost finished, and some ideas of what kind of art will go in there, mainly the SICK collection, this very important collector of Chinese art with many famous Chinese artists, but also very new works of art and media art, projection, performance stands. And also under the slab, this is right under the slab here, that's the light for the skylight that connects to the garden on the podium. We have that kind of container-like spaces which are made for temporary installations. That's a detail of the facade and the view across the windows towards the other side, towards Hong Kong. And in these horizontal lines, we have very thin LED light stripes, which then transform the whole screen in a gigantic image. You can see that on that rendering. This is supposed to be used by artists within a skyline which otherwise is totally commercial. Finally, the third part, landscape. Landscape, but how, what, why? This is a big theme that we have, maybe is less known, even if we have done a lot of research in our ETH studio in Basel. And in fact, and that's what I show you tonight, something that worries me and since the very early days. We now, in the last 10 years or so, we discovered or we proposed some new approach, which became even part, some of it became part of the official planning in Switzerland. But we also published some books, and I don't present really all these projects, but maybe if you're interested, you can find them on our website, because I think it's interesting as a new way to see landscape in relationship to the built city. Somehow the theme is the built and the unbuilt. It's a way to use landscape in order to shape the city, and not the city which shapes the landscape, which leaves something left, which is then the landscape. Or even worse, that landscape is being used by conventional and in a conventional way by Mies van der Rohe or by Le Corbusier as a decoration. This is a very famous example, very famous image, this beautiful sculpture, but I always somehow hated this image because it is, of course, a female, a sculpture, and, you know, which decorates the very perfect, serene, geometrical strictness of the Mysian architecture, which of course is extremely beautiful, but there is an attitude, a psychological attitude in this image where you can see the trees in the background and the female sculpture which is there just for a decoration. It's even worse with Le Corbusier, because Le Corbusier, who made this plan voisin, which I don't want to comment, but the way that he makes these drawings, that he draws the trees, is of course a balcony. You know, there's a balcony, which is of course also in itself very interesting. That from where, with fauteuil, you can admire, you know, the new world with some trees, again, which decorate in between these big towers, this very powerful architecture. Of course, this is another world and is another attitude. Sorry, I wanted these at the very end. Okay. These are two publications. In one, Die Schweiz, ein städtisch-bauliches Porträt, we co-worked with Roger Diener, with Marcel Meile and others, Pierre and myself. We worked for many years in order to try to understand, you know, what we like and what we dislike about Switzerland. The other one, Achtung die Landschaft, is more precise in that attitude that we wanted to say that actually we want to just allow building on what is already built. Switzerland has beautiful landscape, but it's almost nothing is left. And if you compare to Germany or France or Spain, Portugal is maybe somewhere in between. And so our sort of topic was to restrict building on where something is. And of course, then you have issues of densification, and of course you have issues of defining and shaping the landscape in a more productive way. This is the kind of landscape that we know from Switzerland, the very sweet, wonderful landscape defined by mountains and meadows and trees and a few lakes and some glaciers, not so many are left. And of course, if you look closer, it's a very heavily infrastructured landscape with corrected rivers, with trains, with viaducts, all of those things that we like and dislike. And in this whole, so we started mapping Switzerland in that we identified all these different types of landscapes. The sprawl, there are no big cities, but everywhere is somehow city. So that was why we believe that Switzerland is a very important model. And this image here shows you that we tackled or we approached the landscape like architecture, like a building. And we try to understand that we have different areas which we try to give names. We try to give names, and these names were officially adopted, because sometimes you have to give a name to something so people can better understand what urban typologies or landscape typologies exist. So we made this map, which is telling something about density and population. You can see there are three major cities. There's Geneva, Zurich, and Basel. These three cities have a metropolitan status. In Basel, it is three national because it's on the borders of France and Germany. In Geneva, it's French and Swiss. And in Zurich, it's purely Swiss. And in between, you have urban typologies like urban chains. You have alpine resorts, which are very highly considered, like brands like St. Moritz or Davos, and others which are just collapsing, eroding, where young people leave the villages, which are like eroded alpine landscapes, but maybe they are the most interesting ones. And then you have what we call quiet zones. We gave this name quiet zones, and the abandoned alpine areas we called alpine Brachen, which was the name that almost had a political consequence because people who were close to these areas, of course they didn't like to be named or branded like this, but it had political consequences in that landscape was classified and described in a different way. You can see that here. Those are the different names that now have reached an official status. And of course, now there are many projects which define what is the metropolitan area against the different landscapes that remain. And much stricter laws and much stricter ways of developing landscape are being developed. And even at the ETH, now landscape becomes a much more important department equal to architecture. Then we took them out like stamps and collect and put them together again so that one could also see what is the potential of each of those typologies. We also described them in a quite emphatic way that people would not feel offended if they are in a more rural area or if they are in a more urban area. Because in Switzerland, if you live in this or in that canton, you get money from the cantons which are richer than others. So there is quite a balance or équilibre between the different areas. In fact, this preoccupation with landscape started very early in '89. That was shortly after I met Eduardo. Maybe Eduardo, you participated in that also, in that competition for Avenida Diagonal. That was in the time before the Olympics in Barcelona, in this area, in the lower end of the Diagonal. We were asked to do a competition which had not an official character, but it was a competition among young people around El Croquis. And we discovered this kind of sewing plant where in a very clinical and industrial way the city water was purified in a very technological way. This whole area and this track field could be considered as a neglected area. It's like the good city here, the nice and the ugly, the good and the bad. And we thought that instead of just removing and putting hotels here and make space for the Olympics, it would be a main goal to connect the city with that area and with the sea. And this is how this area was looking at that time. You can see this this kind of industrial way that water was cleaned, purification plant, water purification. And we developed a concept that was based on cleaning water on a natural way with plants and animals in a very, very large scale. It was a landscape project where we developed, maybe in a bit naive way, water basins that had a different form and were filled with plants. So the water cleaning process was expressed physically with plants, but was accessible as a garden, as a very unique garden, from where then the cleaned water would go back to the city into some of those rectangular pieces of the Plan Cerdà. This is describing what means what which one of those curves would be pipes, would be plants, would be ribbons, would be different basins with different water qualities and different watercolors. We studied this together with landscape architects and also engineers. And very simply spoken, as I explained, you had this element here which was used as a park, could be used as a park to walk through, to connect between the city and the sea, and to feed the different parts in the city back in the Plan Cerda with specific gardens inside the building blocks, like here. And each would have a different character. So somehow we wanted not only to do a park, but also to do a park which would connect the existing city, which is very dense, with the sea. You can see this in this diagram, the sea on the right-hand side, and the pond system and the beach would create one landscaped area for people of Barcelona and visitors. We took that a bit further in Expo Hanover in '92, where a world exhibition is perhaps as stupid as Olympic Games, but we said if we participate, we want to have a radical proposal, and we did the forest. And the forest, you can see on this model, a huge shape forest, where the shape of the forest would be inspired by the form of the highways which would cross the landscape. And we wanted to integrate all buildings, pavilions in this forest for the exhibition, which then could be transformed in housing areas which are remindful of settlements that we know from Berlin and other places where architecture and forests are melting together. So it would have been a kind of a forest city. Every detail was planned the way that the trees were organized in different lines. Each line was a different species, so the mixture of trees was very precisely organized, almost mathematically organized. We also did parts of forest outside, which would create special vegetation. We would create water in those carved out spaces. You see all these forms are to do with these forms of the highway which pre-existed. And by the way, this project was also inspired by the history of Hanover. Hanover names of villages and small towns in the neighborhood, they carry names like Wülferode, or Rode means cut away forest. So of course, like in many parts of Europe, before people were living, you had to cut down the forest. But in Hanover, this kind of cultural part of our cultural history is still very alive in the names of those cities surrounding Hanover. So this would in fact have been something which goes back in history, but would at the same time, if you imagine, this would have been now 30 years ago, we would now have a forest of 30 years with all these buildings in them. Here we gave examples of that we liked in architecture, how architecture lives together with trees or with vegetation in a more disciplined and strict way, like in the French history, or in a more romantic way, as in England or whatever. We tried to offer different models and different ways of cohabitation between the built and the unbuilt. Of course, the jury didn't like that. So the last example, which I show, is a new project in Moscow, which is, of course, more commercial, but is, I think, a way to nevertheless take on board this issue of landscape, even in very concrete architectural projects. This here is in Moscow River, very central located, right across from the red square. This here is an old brewery that we have to keep and to restore. And this is the river bed, which is not really used because it's not public. This is a very interesting plot, but is now currently is not really part of the city yet. You can see from the other side is one of those big sisters projects which are admired by many Western architects. You can see that currently the river bed here, the river bank, is not really activated, and this is more a ruin than an interesting piece of architecture, and especially it's not accessible. So one first step was to map all these historical buildings, which were quite interesting. In fact, some we did rebuild, and some we just transform into new types of programming, like housing, but also different kind of leisure offices, co-work office, co-work spaces, restaurants, etc. So this is in itself was an important initiative of the investor to bring that back and make it a contemporary piece of architecture in Moscow, because Moscow has a history in Soviet architecture where protecting historic buildings was not first priority. On the contrary, they took down most of the interesting historic spaces. So we had to shape and reshape that and define one end here on that side, opening up to the city. And of course, to provide a boulevard, and of course we wanted to create as much a garden for the people as possible. And how could we do that? We made a lot of images and wanted to get familiar with the project, with the buildings, and the potential of the buildings were quite amazing, as you can see here, inside and outside. But then, because we had to implement a lot of floor area to make it a commercial project, this is showing all kinds of different typologies to put buildings on that plot. And had we done any of them, we would have filled up more or less the whole area, and we would have created a block or a barricade rather than a park and an inviting new area. So we said priority number one is to bring back life to these buildings, to open up the boulevard here on the river and connect it to the rest, and to make it permeable, permeability of the whole area. And the only way to do this was to lift up the whole structure above ground, and so that we would see the historic buildings across from the river, and nevertheless have substantial amount of volume and floor area for housing and retail and offices. So we have these three layers that make for the project the riverbank and the park, the brewery behind, and then on stilts, a hovering piece of architecture. And this hovering piece is maybe mindful of Lisitsky or other constructivist architecture. And I tell you, even if as an architect everybody admires, or as a student everybody admires Lisitsky, you never believe that you can ever think of doing something like this. And in fact, we wanted to avoid the heroic gesture of Lisitsky, which is this hovering piece, in that we put it on many thin stilts, not one or two columns, very powerful, but many, which would make it far less distant and far less awe-inspiring. Because we wanted the green climb up the structures. We wanted the structure to connect you and not to create too much of a distance. Nevertheless, light, of course, should shine from both sides, and sun. So the structure and the park should live well together. And of course, the project allows now for opening up that part of the riverbank and to connect the riverbank with the park and the brewery and the other side of the city. We hope that we can start construction very soon, even if there is some opposition from neighbors. But at the same time, the mayor and many people believe that this would be the next building that we can do in Moscow. This is the last image. Thank you. Do you think that there are questions? Yeah.
So if there are any questions in the room, Jacques Herzog will be kindly taking a few questions in either English or Portuguese. We'll translate for him. Any? Well, we wait. I'll start with one which has not much to do with what you really showed tonight, in a sense. Because I was, perhaps we can talk about it later. I was very curious about the beginning of the landscape discussion in Switzerland, which I think it's extremely interesting in terms of the landscape of that country. But Eduardo in the introduction said something which I think it's also very dear to this institution, which is your connection to the art world, your collaboration with artists. And we only saw, you've done many things. We only saw the collaboration, one of the collaborations with Thomas Wolff. And I was wondering whether you could say a few words how do you really approach collaboration with artists, which is always, this notion of ornament or whatever is very tricky. When do you bring them in? Probably there's very different experiences, and I'm certain there are. Sometimes they might be part of early conversations. Sometimes you might already have an idea, and then you might think of the right artist or whatever. Would you mind saying a couple of words about that? Because or do you think it's too broad a question?
No. I'm very happy if people ask me. You can ask me anything. I felt personally closer to artists than to architecture at the beginning because I was not sure whether I should not do sculpture and installation, and which I did actually. But I did it not well enough. I was not good enough as an artist to fulfill my own expectation, and so architecture was somehow more a medium in which I felt I could express or do something new. Do something that, as I said at the beginning, that I thought did not exist, or at least I think a young architect always has to find a way to enter into this world. And so architecture was more that than art. But I maintained all my love and admiration for artists and for the world of art, and I still do that, because art always had a more utopian side than architecture, and a freer side. And I always admire artists because if they wake up in the morning, they have nobody tells them anything that they could do, and to fulfill your life, to fill out your life with this blank canvas is very difficult. I tell you, I think that many times architects complain that they are not free enough, but I think architects should be glad to not be so free, because otherwise they would not be able to do anything. because you need a program, you need a concrete site, you need restrictions, because this is also part of our life. Wherever we are, this is also true for landscape. Everywhere that we go, there is something, and architecture is to do with dealing what is there, and to do it nice for people, but of course also for you. And this is the art of architecture. But as I said, artists can do other things, and sometimes we found ourselves in a situation that we wanted to do something with artists, but never that, well, now this is an empty space, we need an artist to put something in it. This is what Mies did, you know. But I like the opposite. I like to take the artist with me, and he knows nothing and I know nothing. And we go somewhere and we develop. We did with Remy Zaug, we did analysis of, before even analyzing Switzerland, we analyzed Basel, and we discovered the city in which we lived and we knew nothing about. And we developed a method which is about describing with no academic backpack, with no diagrams, no computers, nothing. We just look and we try to understand. And the artist does that in a very precise, in a very naive way, you know. Artists are, the great artists, they are totally nude. They have no clothes on, you know. You have to be innocent and naive, also as an architect, I think. Otherwise you go nowhere. If you pretend to know everything, you go nowhere. And this is that's the interesting thing. Now, I don't know, Álvaro just told me that he sees architecture a bit in an agony. I think that not only architecture, I think that art and many other things, we should not complain, but we can nevertheless understand differences. Today, artists, I don't think that, like in the 70s, I was hanging around with artists all the time, and they were like we were looking for new things. Today, I don't see that scene so much anymore, because artists, either they are super successful and they go to big galleries pretty soon, or they are nowhere. And even, you know, we know many famous artists, but it's not the same thing. They are not so innocent anymore, and we are also not so innocent anymore. So this is like more difficult now to start from scratch, you know. But I think to start from scratch is what makes it worth, you know, that you get up in the morning and you start with a fresh project, and this moment that you try to find out what is really the potential of the project is a fascinating moment. And yeah, and art in this has always supported me.
You raised this very interesting issue of constraints and freedom, which is actually key to art and architecture. Do we have any questions in the? Okay, thank you, please. You wait for the mic, please. Are there any more questions, just to see if there's anyone else who get an idea? Okay, there's going to be a second question, and then probably.
Okay.
Thank you.
I have one question that comes from a conversation that it took place here 1 month ago, more or less, with the Siza, about the work of Siza. And in that conference, he said that, so Siza explained that the context is a fundamental support for the design process. However, it should not be seen like a mold. This means that sometimes the best strategy is to work by contrast or opposition. And my question is, how do you see the relation with the context, and how do you develop, or not, in your architecture, this dialogue with the surrounding reality?
I totally agree. I think we should not be overly hypocrite, to have too much hypocrisy with the context. The context is, of course, always here, so you do something with the context, but you cannot say what is good or what is bad for the context. But you always, Snotzi, that we all like very much, says something very interesting about that. You know, when you do something as an architect, you destroy something. So if you destroy, you have to destroy very well. And it's like the butcher, you know, he kills the animal or he cuts pieces. That's okay, but he has to cut it well. Otherwise, it's, you know, it's not good. And I think that is true. When, as an architect, you transform, you always change, you know, and we believe we change for the good. But yeah, I mean, in this case, the context is the given brewery, and you can take it down if you do something tabula rasa. That can be a good project, why not? But we decided, and supported, of course, by the municipality, to maintain the buildings and to give them more value. And why did we do this? Not because I love the building or I'm so nice with the existing building, but because I think if we give them a new life, they animate the whole thing. They made the whole thing more interesting. I think morality is not a good advisor. You know, we should not behave like moralists. We should just be open and we should be honest, but not as a moral quality. You know, as a quality that we have to be honest. Otherwise, we fuck up everything. You know, especially our own work. That's an advice I could give.
We take one more question. If you could send the mic behind. Couple of rows behind, and that's it.
Well, I really appreciated the issues that you put on landscape, taking Switzerland as an example. I remember André Corbos, who wrote about how we moved from a palimpsest situation, looking at Switzerland, to an hypertextual situation, which means that we are today dealing with different texts, and we have to deal with this kind of overlaying or overexposure of layers. And I think your architecture is, for me at least, a very good example of this hypertextual reality that we live in. But that hypertextual condition also puts us beyond the problem between artificial and natural. And I really think that we are now heading into a kind of cynical position when we design buildings as nature, and we design nature as artificial buildings. We, looking at your architecture, for example, your buildings want to be nests, or want to be trees, or want to be something that looks like a natural feature. And then you speak about how you use landscape, and you speak about creating a forest in a kind of artificial way, or using landscape in a very abstract way. So in a way, it's a kind of reversed situation that we're living today, where natural seems artificial, and artificial seems to wish to be natural.
I disagree, and I agree in some. We never mimic nature. We never do a building which looks like a tree, or we never have this kind of biological or botanic analogy. I'm not at all interested in that. These slender columns have nothing to do with trees. It's just because they are slender, they are less imposing. So you should take things very directly, you know. And of course, I think that vegetation can be very important in cities. We need to bring in vegetation in cities because of the climate, hot climate that is increasingly creating difficult conditions so I see this in a very pragmatic way. So vegetation invades the city, and of course the city invades the countryside in that it has infrastructural projects. We should do these infrastructural projects, which are very interesting in themselves, also highways, in a good way. We also work on a project in Switzerland as one of these examples, where infrastructures like highways or train lines are being occupied by buildings, but maybe they can also be occupied by plants. I think that this hybrid is not necessarily bad. It's probably a future that, you know, it all depends on the quality. Do it well, that's all I can say. I mean, I think that's like a next lecture. You know, we could speak about digital technologies. We are very interested in this, even if I personally start every project with hand drawings because it's faster and easier. But I'm as well and as much interested in digital technologies. And the real thing with digital digital technology is not that I can do things like this rendering so well, so it looks like a real building. That's the easy part. The real change in digital technology is that it will change ourselves. And if it changes ourselves, we are not the same kind of humans, the simple humans, who can appreciate the quality of such a table because it has a beauty, it has a tactile quality. Maybe we are different beings, you know, and that's then the end of this discussion is here. You know, everything is hybrid. So far, and I think in my projects that I presented, in our projects, you know, because I always speak also in the name of Pierre and my company, we quite precisely deal with what is artificial and what is natural, you know. And we all, I think, enjoy, you know, being in a place where all of a sudden, you know, this is really almost untouched nature. Maybe it's the desert or is, you know, I showed some mountain areas. But in Switzerland, indeed, almost no square meter is really left natural. Because you have restaurants on top, you have these trains, you have these ferries, the glaciers will go away, and then the glaciers go away, it will be even more easy to access places. And when people can do something, they do it, whether you forbid it or not.
Okay, I think that's it. Thank you so much for coming for the 5th time to Porto, for the 1st time to Serralves, and for sharing some thoughts and works with all of us. Thank you, Pierre.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you, Jacques.
Thank you.